Anti-LGBT laws in Russia are being aimed at the country's most vulnerable population so that Putin can justify his war in Ukraine as an existential battle against Satanism. I'm Tikhon Zitko, and this is Russia Tomorrow. Putin says the West is imposing gender diversity and perversions on Russia, and now the Russian government is beginning to mobilize homophobia in order to distract public attention from its failures in the war. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man once called Putin's chef, has begun calling for the removal of military and civilian officials whom he calls corrupt thieves, and for the shutdown of access to YouTube and Google. With just one word, officials in Russia have declared a new enemy and gone completely insane. That word is desatanization.
TV Rain, Дождь, the only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that.
There will be very serious consequences.
TV Rain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
Putin says the West is imposing gender diversity and other perversions on Russia. And now the Russian government is beginning to mobilize homophobia in order to distract public attention from its failures in the war.
Если западные элиты полагают, что смогут внедрить в сознание своих людей, своих обществ, странноватые, на мой взгляд, но новомодные тенденции вроде десятков гендеров и гей-парадов, так тому и быть. Да пускай делают, что хотят. Но на что они точно не имеют права, так это требовать от других следовать в том же направлении.
Russia's propaganda targets have changed with the flow of combat. First, they came to fight the Nazis in Ukraine. Then, Russia started losing badly, and the new target was NATO biolabs with weaponized mosquitoes.
Остается без ответа вопрос о патенте США номер...
There's still an unanswered question about US patent number 8967029BU1, dated March 3rd, 2015, where a trademark was issued for an unmanned aerial vehicle for the dissemination of infected mosquitoes. That is, equipment that is intended as a technical apparatus for the delivery and use of biological weapons, biological agents, bacteria, and viruses, including highly contingent variants that could, quote, eliminate all enemy personnel.
It may sound ridiculous, because it certainly is, but in the fertile soil of Russian state TV, the seeds of a crazy conspiracy theory can grow into a jungle of emotion and fears. Now, after Putin has begun to lose his credibility in the wake of so many strategic failures, the propaganda targets have shifted once again. Russia's greatest enemies are now Western Satanists who wrap themselves in the rainbow flag.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы у нас здесь, в нашей стране, в России, вместо мамы и папы был родитель номер 1, номер 2, номер 3? Совсем спятили уже. Разве мы хотим, чтобы в наших школах с начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию? Чтобы им вдалбливали, что кроме женщины и мужчины якобы существуют еще некие гендеры.
The Kremlin's newest propaganda target is now the LGBT community, normal human beings whose sexuality does not conform to a standard binary pair. But to avoid sounding like uneducated bigots, the Kremlin says it is only protecting children from so-called LGBT propaganda, and has even set its sights on the American sitcom Friends for its positive portrayal of fictional gay characters.
Нужно было иметь очень хорошее зрение, чтобы заметить.
You would have to have a very keen eye to notice that in the show Friends, which first came out in 1994, the first episode begins with the main character coming in, looking depressed and lonely because his wife had left him for a woman. And all of this is shown rather sympathetically. Good for her, the show says, and sucks for him. That was 1994. Noticing clear, brazen propaganda in this was almost impossible because it was so new and so radical.
In the last week of October, the Russian Duma unanimously approved legislation aimed at what they call preventing the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations. Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin introduced the law, and more than 300 deputies from all coalition parties signed on as co-authors. There were no votes against.
We have to return our government ideology to the Constitution. Otherwise, we will be doomed to the sexual minorities dominating politics, just like what has already happened in the West.
The propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships is war. It's a spiritual war, a war of information, an ideological war.
In this latest distraction from Putin's war in Ukraine, the exaggerated fears of Western pro-LGBT propaganda are so strong that hateful Russian anti-LGBT propaganda has begun circulating on state TV. And why not? In April, state broadcasters said they found gay materials for kids in a destroyed Mariupol bomb shelter that they said was funded by the US government.
Words can't describe what we're finding here. It's an attack on children, on the most vulnerable people in society. One house that we found, back from when it was still Ukraine and they had NATO bases there, used to be the headquarters of an organization of non-traditional sexual orientations, gays, lesbians, and everything else. It was directly funded by the American independent agency USAID. The house had a sign saying exactly that. If you look at the history of this organization, then you can see it is essentially directly sponsored by the US President and Congress.
But now the propaganda is personal, and the attacks on individuals and institutions are increasing. This week, Russia's top propagandist Vladimir Solovyov set the tone with hateful insults and slurs that he broadcast live on air.
Вообще что-то происходит со всеми этими либеральными звездами. У кого-то, конечно, полное счастье, а у кого-то, кажется, полное несчастье. Вот, например, был такой Зыгорь, который, конечно, не просто гей, а просто конченый, да, гей. И вот теперь у него такое счастье в жизни, и он не может его не выложить, не поделиться. Это прям так трогательно.
Mikhail Zygar, our colleague and the former editor-in-chief of TV Rain, married his husband, Jean-Michel Sherbak, in Portugal last week, and is now a target for anti-gay hate on state TV by Solovyov, Russia's propaganda king.
И вот эти два счастливых гея, при этом, яху, у них такая радость, вот, ну, конечно, полку прибыло, яху, это же просто такое счастье. И Зыгорь, он такой счастливый, он так об этом написал, что это вообще это надо понимать. Он, правда, не знает, как теперь правильно это все называть. То есть он не знает, как вот эту всю мразь, мерзость, всю эту тлетворность и гадость, как ее назвать. И вот он у себя пишет: «Мы поженились». Наверное, правильно говорить: вышли замуж. Любовь, свобода, правда, счастье. Пора начинать освобождение самих себя. А в каких кандалах вы находились?
The truth is that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in Russia, human beings with feelings and emotions and the same need for human love as everyone else, are a useful tool for Putin and his propagandists. Instead of respecting their human rights, the Kremlin turns the LGBT community into an object of categorical hate by an irrational fear called homophobia, reinforced by basic human ignorance and stupidity. And this homophobia is a pathway to more drastic measures that are being used to incite the Russian people further into a war the Kremlin now says is against the forces of darkness and evil.
А теперь вся страна должна встать на войну. И стиснув зубы, потому что воюем не с этой бандеровской сволочью и педиками в ее управлении, а воюем со всей сатанинской машиной Запада.
And now we're joined by Russian journalist Stanislav Kucher. Stanislav, welcome. Thanks for joining me here.
Hi, Tihan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, so even by official polling, we can see that the support for Putin is falling. Is this anti-LGBT propaganda just another attempt to change his popular standing?
Well, I'm pretty positive that you know and I know that one of the main problems of today's Russia is the absence of any coherent ideology, right? Every time we hear from Putin or his propaganda peddlers something like, we must not allow the West to destroy the soulless West, to destroy our system, our genetic code, and our values, we realize this is complete nonsense, because it's worth remembering that Kremlin does not have any structured ideology, any structured mindset, and we don't expect them to have that. They have nothing to do except trying to oppose like they, us, Putin, vs the rest of the world. And so they try to search, find, exaggerate, and oppose certain what they believe are ideological points. And basically, these are old, dusty postulates from their dense past, partly Soviet, partly criminal. And one of these points is the attitude to the very idea, to the very topic of LGBTQ. And I'm absolutely sure that, for example, if today's Europe and the United States were publicly and openly homophobic, then Putin's Russia would be at the front line of the LGBTQ rights movement. And since Europe and the States are they openly stand for human rights and tolerance. So the Kremlin saddled the theme of rejection of both human rights and the rights of LGBTQ. And moreover, I would say that this rhetoric perfectly fits into both the Soviet cultural and psychological tradition and the criminal one. And so, yes, the guys in the State Duma, in the Russian parliament, they strongly believe that every time they come up with something against LGBTQ, that will definitely be supported by that, what I call silently obedient majority of Russians who support whatever Putin is doing. But another thing is that right now we're not talking about repressions. I mean, we don't witness any repressions at this point. And I like to stress that it's only at this point. I emphasize for now, okay? While we're talking about the legitimization of prosecution for propaganda, the dissemination of content that, according to Putin's legislators, popularizes the topic of LGBTQ. That is, so far, again, at this point, there are no repressions directed against LGBTQ representatives, at least not in the bills that we see, which are right now under consideration or have passed the first reading in the State Duma. And according to what we see, again, according to all those initiatives, it will be possible to persecute, for example, you, Tihan, or me, if we come up with the idea of launching a series with main characters that are gay on Dozhd or, for example, on my YouTube channel or elsewhere. So that's where we are now. But that does not mean that repressions are anywhere not near, because they are pretty close. And it's only one step to real repressions from where we are now.
But this rhetoric, this anti-LGBT rhetoric, how effectively could this work in his favor, in Putin's favor? I mean, in your opinion, is Russian society actually homophobic, or it's just a stereotype which is being used by the Russian government?
Well, I mean, here you, Tihan, and I, again, have we can draw conclusions from our personal experience, right? From talking with different people and representatives of what we would call the Russian society. And let's say I was born and brought up in the Soviet Union. I was 19 when the Soviet Union broke up, right? So right now we see that the older generation of Russians, let's say 45 plus or 50 plus, they are more homophobic than the younger generation of Russians, okay, who already have been brought in the early zeros or in the 90s with the idea that, yeah, okay, LGBTQ are fine and just are as rightful members of our society as anybody else. So I would say that I don't think this will work, especially not now. I mean, I don't even believe that the initiatives the parliamentarians, the so-called parliamentarians, have come up with has anything to do with the attempt to boost Vladimir Putin's popularity. I don't think they themselves had that in mind. What they had in mind is just come up with something else, something that would, in their opinion, make them look as the defenders of the so-called traditional values. Why? Again, because they have nothing else to offer to the Russian public. They have no ideology whatsoever. And unfortunately, or fortunately, they just don't have, they don't have the brains, they don't have the intellectual capacity to come up with something really structured and something new. You know this famous expression that every century has their own dark ages. So ever since, I guess, at least ever since Putin's, third term in 2012, Russia's entered its dark ages and have been coming up with one weird anti-human initiative after another. So again, there is nothing new about this, and I don't think this will work for Putin's popularity. Honestly, judging from what I see and hear from my friends, acquaintances in Russia, judging from what I read in on Russian social media, I can't think of anything that can raise Putin's popularity at this point. It's diminishing rapidly, and this is the process that can hardly be stopped.
You've been living in the United States for the last several years. Do you see any...
3.5 years.
Yeah. Do you see any similarities between the way Russian authorities and American conservatives or the representatives of the Republican Party use anti-LGBT issues to their own political gain? For example, build on this reality about us and they?
Well, again, trying to divide, to rule and divide is a pretty old tradition, as we both know, right? And of course, you can find similarities between what Putin and his coterie are doing right now and with what hardline Republicans or Trump supporters have been doing in the past. You can find those similarities, but I would not really emphasize them to the point where we can say that they're doing exactly the same thing. No, they're not. And again, here we come to a question of whether the Russian society is homophobic or not. And we can address the American society with a similar question. Is it homophobic or not? You will always find a certain number of homophobes in America and in Russia. How popular their ideas are depends on what the society and the government is doing about it. I mean, if the government and the society support those ideas openly, then those guys become the mainstream. If not, they don't. And so in the States, no matter what the rhetoric of Trump or some of hardline conservatives in the US can be, I don't see any reason how it can possibly become something of a mainstream in this country, whereas it definitely a part of the mainstream ideology in Russia.
All right. Thank you so much, Stanislav Kucher. Thanks for joining me here on Russia Tomorrow.
Russia Tomorrow.
Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man once called Putin's chef, has begun a vocal campaign calling for the removal of military and civilian officials whom he calls corrupt thieves, and for the Russian prosecutor's office to shut down access to YouTube and Google. Evgeniy Prigozhin has used his long friendship with Vladimir Putin to build an eccentric and vicious career as the man the Kremlin calls on to do its dirty work. Last week, Prigozhin, who up until recently avoided the spotlight, went several steps further and showed just how influential he really is. In a series of social media posts over the past months, Prigozhin has called for the removal of General Alexander Lapin, the commander of the Russian Armed Forces Central Military and the man in charge of most ground forces in Ukraine.
Kadyrov's expressive statement maybe isn't quite my style, but I will say, well done, Ramzan, go on. All those losers to the front barefoot with machine guns.
On Saturday, after Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov supported Prigozhin's criticism on social media, Lapin was actually removed from his duties.
The fighters that are most effective today have been through dozens of wars, but many of those so-called professionals have only learned how to click their heels, wear the right uniform, and write beautiful reports. Let the hard-working soldiers work towards victory and minimizing losses, and let's get rid of the slackers. Ramzan Akhmatovich knows who I'm talking about.
And now Prigozhin has set his sights on the removal of St. Petersburg's governor, Alexander Beglov, calling for an investigation into allegations of state budget theft with the help of criminal records created by Governor Beglov.
Today, on October 31st, 2022, I, Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin, sent the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation a statement requesting an investigation into the possible creation of an organized criminal ring by Governor A.T. Beglov for the purpose of plundering the state budget and enriching the corrupt officials in his entourage.
Neither Beglov nor Prigozhin are pristine political angels, and as many analysts say, it's hard to take sides in a fight between a snake and a poisonous toad. But the public accusations mark a significant turn of events as Putin's chef accumulates more unaccountable power at the president's side. As Lapin eventually fell, will Beglov soon go too? In a related story, this week, Yevgeny Prigozhin filed more official complaints, this time in an official letter to the Russian Prosecutor General's office. But instead of aiming his accusations at a corrupt politician or an incompetent officer, Prigozhin went after YouTube and Google, alleging that both companies actively censor Russian video channels and spread threats against the country.
Please check the facts set forth in this statement and restrict access to YouTube.com. Please also consider the issue of recognizing unwanted activities by the American company Google LLC on the territory of the Russian Federation, which disseminated information aiming to threaten the self-defense and security of the country.
Prigozhin has transformed from a shadowy man behind the walls of power into an unelected public politician with enormous influence. He now sits at the top of Putin's power vertical with direct access to the president and a seemingly unlimited budget for his exploits. As a young man in the 1970s, Prigozhin attended a sports boarding school and trained in cross-country skiing. But after a criminal conviction for involving teenagers in prostitution, among other crimes, he served 9 years of a 12-year sentence in various Russian prisons. Upon release, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he sold hot dogs on the streets of St. Petersburg and began his lucrative career as an entrepreneur. In St. Petersburg, Prigozhin built a restaurant empire during what Putin calls the wild 90s and later got his start in government affairs with the contracts to feed VIPs at Kremlin banquets. The Petersburg native then went on to build a federal media company and a social media hacking group called the Troll Factory that published thousands of fake stories and influenced public opinion in foreign countries around the world. But perhaps Prigozhin's crowning achievement in Russian government contracting has come as CEO of the Wagner Group, a private military company that fights alongside Russian forces in Syria, the Central African Republic, and now Ukraine. Despite Russia's legal prohibition of private mercenaries, this year Prigozhin has been recruiting tens of thousands of Russian prisoners to pick up a weapon and fight a war for Putin in exchange for their freedom.
Но если вы поехали с нами, обратной дороги уже нет. В зону не вернется никто.
That Prigozhin now leads the charge against YouTube and Google can only mean that the days of open and unrestricted access to the world's most widely used internet search engines are numbered. What purpose would an official block on YouTube serve in Russia? Now, in Russia, YouTube is no longer a space for bloggers telling about how they spend their days. If YouTube is blocked, tens of millions would lose access to quality global journalism, as well as Russian language news channels that provide an alternative to the Kremlin's propaganda. Such is the case with TV Rain. Our Russian language YouTube channel serves more than 13 million unique monthly visitors, with daily live stream broadcasts and growing archives of news and information for internet users. If Prigozhin is successful in shutting off access to YouTube, he would also succeed in helping to narrow and restrict what Russians can watch, read, and hear about their own country. A complete block on YouTube would leave ordinary citizens in the dark, with nothing but hours of hateful propaganda that state TV uses to hide the Kremlin's lies.
Russia tomorrow.
With just one word, officials in Russia have declared a new enemy and gone completely insane. That word is desatanization. With more on this, we now turn to our TV Rain colleague, Mikhail Fishman.
Our goal is the desatanization of Ukraine. Putin started this war under the banner of denazification. He pretended to free the Ukrainian people from the oppression of the Nazis in the Ukrainian government. Now, 8 months later, the narrative is different. Putin and his army are warriors of light who have come out to fight the forces of darkness, and the future of humanity depends on the outcome of this battle. Let's look at how this happened. Recently, at the Valdai Forum in Sochi, Putin was asked what his plan in Ukraine was, because no one seems to know.
You and other Russian officials have repeatedly said that the special operation is going to plan, but people aren't really sure what the plan actually is. So what's the plan?
Putin replies, Donbas, our goal is to help Donbas. Quite modest, isn't it? Putin needs a break. He is losing the war. The Ukrainian military is advancing in the south and east, retaking occupied territories. And Putin needs to stop the fighting, to freeze the conflict, at least until he can build up a new army. Therefore, communicating to the outside world, he deliberately plays down his ambitions. But domestically, these goals are not sufficient. Does it mean that Russia's military suffered such great losses just for the sake of Donbas? That's why Putin lost an entire army. That's why now he drafted hundreds of thousands of more men. Inside Russia, this cannot be the reason for the first mass mobilization since World War II. Mobilization brought the war to everyone's doorstep. It means it's serious. It means it's about defending the motherland. The Russian sociological project Extreme Scan confirms this. Since the start of mobilization, public opinion has changed its attitude towards the war.
Previously, respondents' answers to open-ended questions were dominated by rhetoric related to actions on the territory of Ukraine, protection of the Russian-speaking population of the LPR and DPR, denazification, demilitarization, overthrowing Ukrainian authorities, the capture and return of Russian territory, or saving Ukrainians. Now they respond with more defensively minded actions. Protection, and this was the most common word used in response to open-ended questions, of the homeland from Ukraine, NATO and the West, to stop the war, end it quickly, and support the army.
So what is needed is a heroic mentality. People must believe that this is another great patriotic war, just like World War II. The Great Patriotic War version 2.0 is what the manuals handed out to the drafted men call it. The same instructions were given to television channels. This is no longer just a special military operation, but a people's war with NATO, which wants to destroy Russia. Yet, there is a problem. Russia has fought two people's wars, in 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, and in 1941, when it was invaded by Nazi Germany. By default, people's war is a defensive war. But no one is attacking Russia. On the contrary, it is Russia that has invaded Ukraine and is bombing Kiev. That is why the authorities of the frontline Russian regions are pretending to be preparing for war at home. In the Kursk region bordering Ukraine, bomb shelters are being erected. Near Belgorod, which is 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, anti-tank fortifications are being erected. This is entirely pointless, doesn't make any sense. Neither NATO nor Ukraine intends to send tank divisions to Russia. This is pure PR. Propaganda sends the scary message. This is what will happen if Russians show any weakness.
Это экзистенциальная война.
This is an existential war. We are moving into a people's war. This isn't a situation where you can end up with a draw. And let's agree that no one is going to negotiate with us. As soon as they sense any weakness from us, if they suddenly sense any weakness, they'll throw everything they have at us.
But this PR is not enough, not entirely convincing. Why is this war an existential threat? What does it mean to show weakness? A people's war is when everyone feels like they are part of the effort, explains Sergei Kiriyenko. 20-something years ago, in a previous era, he was prime minister and the leader of pro-Western Liberal Party. Now he is a high-ranking Kremlin official and the political manager of occupied Ukrainian lands. No one should be left out, he says. In other words, everyone should support Putin.
Как они могут победить?
How can they win? Only by dividing us. Only if someone living in Ural believes that defending the rights of Donbass residents isn't their problem. If that person believes that the problems of Donbass don't concern someone living in Ural or the Far East, if they think, it's their problem, I can keep living like I usually would, and it will never concern me.
The war will reach everyone, and the Kremlin will make sure of that. People joke on Twitter in Russia, yachts and mansions are private, but when it comes to war, it's a people's war. In reality, it is not a people's war, it's a semi-people's war, just the same as Putin calling for limited mobilization and declaring a partial martial law. This isn't a people's war, but it is a people and state war. The state and the people it brings to the battlefield will fight, and everyone else has to engage emotionally, has to treat this war in absolute terms. It's either us or them. The West is imposing gender diversity and other perversions on Russia, Putin explained in his speech on the annexation of the occupied territories of Ukraine.
Do we really want to have parent number 1, parent number 2, and parent number 3 in this country instead of mothers and fathers? Has everyone gone mad?
It is no coincidence that Putin brought up his favorite topic. In late October, the lawmakers introduced a new bill against LGBT propaganda. Official homophobia appeared in Russia in 2013, when the Russian parliament adopted a law banning LGBT propaganda among children. But now that's not enough. Now everyone has to be protected. Here's how one of the lawmakers who introduced this law explains it.
The special military operation isn't just taking place on the battlefields, but in people's minds, hearts, and souls. Today, we are also fighting so that in Russia, in the words of the president, there will not be parent number 1, parent number 2, and parent number 3 instead of mom and dad.
This sounds absolutely insane. Russia is bombing Kiev and Kharkov because the West accepts gender diversity and gay pride. But that's exactly how Putin and his bureaucrats justify it. Because they know propaganda has been fueling homophobia in Russian society in recent years. 9 years ago, the introduction of anti-gay propaganda legislation in Russia had a simple, practical reason: to switch the public debate agenda. Back then, anti-Putin sentiment was strong. You remember the huge, largest ever protests in Moscow and other cities at that time, don't you? So the Kremlin came up with an idea. Instead of criticizing the government, let's debate homosexuality. And now it's the time for a sequel. Now the Kremlin and its propaganda machine use homophobia to justify Putin's war with Ukraine, to brand it as a civilizational war. Russia is destroying Ukraine, but the West is attacking Russia from within with its filth. This is a holy war, and Russia needs its own jihad. These are the slogans spilling out from under the Kremlin walls.
Правильно это назвать священная война!
It's right to call it a holy war. A holy war. Because Muslims have this idea of jihad, A war that isn't just a mortal war with your enemies on the battlefield, but a war that's first of all with your sins in your soul. And the greatest battle of our holy war will take place in our souls.
By background, Putin is not a zealot. He is an opportunist. What he cares about is power, not ideas or any ultimate truth. He evolved into an alt-right simply because progressives and supporters of Western democracy opposed him. But propaganda doesn't just indoctrinate the nation, it can also reinforce the views of the propagandist himself. Putin has long surrounded himself with conspiracy theorists who believe that COVID was invented in Washington in order to thin out the population of the Earth and that the World Health Organization has the mission to control people's health globally. The famous film director Nikita Mikhalkov is a very influential figure. He meets with Putin and his inner circle. There is no doubt that he whispers in their ears the same crazy stuff that he was saying on stage 2 months ago.
Сегодня идет религиозная война.
This is a war of religion. Let me just give you an example. WHO, the World Health Organization, takes responsibility for the classification of diseases. In 1919, homosexuality is taken out from the list of mental illnesses.
And then Mikhalkov goes on with a story of how gender diversity became a norm and that it is part of the devil's plan to destroy humanity. And Putin's war is a war with the devil, with the Antichrist, who has descended to earth in the form of gay marriage, gender diversity and equality.
Пересмотреть позицию.
To consider the position that outside male and female there are other genders. What is that? It's a neat way to carry out the gradual extinction of mankind. Is that not demonic? Is it not the devil?
Of course, this is what Putin wants to believe. Who would desire to be a tyrant and an aggressor killing Ukrainians for his insane ambitions? And a mediocre war leader who has managed to lose an entire army? Isn't it much more pleasing to be a warrior of light who fights demons from the underworld in a battle in which the future of mankind is at stake? That is how a wild conspiracy theory becomes a political platform. There, on the same stage, Mikhalkov goes, "This is a war on Satanism," and Putin used the same words when announcing the annexation of the occupied Ukrainian territories. Battle with Satanism. That's why he's taking Donbas together with Kherson and Zaporizhia.
Это вызов всем.
It's a challenge to everyone. This complete denial of humanity, rejection of faith and traditional values, and suppression of freedom has the religious characteristics of unabashed Satanism.
Following Putin's footsteps, the state machine renews its agenda. Russia fights Satan. The future of humanity is at stake, as if Putin's war with Ukraine were another comic book from the Marvel universe. Before our eyes, Putin and his officials evolve into a cult, a fringe sect, a team of fanatics. They reject the world around them. They seem to be ready for its violent end. In their war with the Antichrist, it doesn't matter which side is pure evil. What matters is they expect the apocalypse. 8 months ago, Putin wanted to overthrow Zelensky in 3 days, but something went wrong. Now, for him, it is a holy war with the whole world, a matter of life and death for humanity, and his hand is on the nuclear button.
Russia Tomorrow.
Thank you for watching Russia Tomorrow, and thank you for your support of our international newsroom, where we turn our focus from an audience inside Russia and publish a weekly summary of the most important news in English. Please like and subscribe and help us in our efforts to bring the truth from Russia to the world. Our GoFundMe link is below in the description, and your kind cash donations help us keep the lights on and fight the darkness. I'm Tikhon Zitko. See you soon.